Hello, this is Brian Briggs. Here's my explanation of my research involving earned value methodology. What is earned value methodology? Earned value methodology establishes a value index as it relates to performance. You can relate it to cost, you can relate it to business, you can pretty much relate it to just about anything as long as you established a performance index with the project team. What is an acceptable performance index to use? Well, for my project and my research, I established that to be 0.98. Uh, I took a course in data analytics and project leadership with Cornell University, and the acceptable range in industry standards for engineering is 0.90 to 1.0, 1.0 being the greatest. And I'll get more into detail about that range. Uh, Using earned value methodology in construction management, I've established that I have not seen it in organizations that I've worked with other than the DoD, Department of Defense, of which I've spent many years in the Army Corps of Engineers and engineering for the military, where they do use the earned value methodology, but they use it more of a cost. Nothing more to measure profit margin, whether or not you're over or under on materials, over and under on production, over and under in labor cost. The reason for that is that the government doesn't necessarily deal with labor costs. They are concerned about production as it relates to the general contractor that they contract with. As far as materials, that's the concern of the GC, not a concern of the government unless there's a change order that's involved. Uh, as we continue, my research objectives was to establish an acceptable range, which I've established that to be 0.98. And that 0.98 was established to determine whether or not production and profit margin was going to be affected. And so 0.98 was that established range. Um, the correlation interval to predict an acceptable band of success from the 1.0 was plus or minus 2%, and that's where I got the 0.98. Um, earned value methodology, it can be established and used to determine key performance indicators and whether or not your project is progressing in a positive manner, or whether or not it is being affected by whatever variables that are determined. But you're going to have to do a deep root analysis to determine which variable in your project controls is affecting your project. And so the determining what those key performance indicators are is in your project controls and what data that you are tracking, what data that you are collecting, and what data that you're reporting. And so in each of those categories, depending on what section that you are working in, and if those sections are not collaborating, it could vary. It could vary a lot. So if you're tracking production and someone else is tracking materials, someone else is tracking the schedule, and someone else is tracking the cost, which is the norm in the construction industry, if none of those are establishing a once a week or once every 2 week meeting to collaborate on where those performance index are lining up, you can have huge problems in your project. So the project information that I'm providing, so I established a project. It's a static catalytic resistor project, units, 2 units, each of them being a 1250 megawatt boiler. And what a static catalytic resistor is, it is a huge HEPA filler, ammonia based, that takes the exhaust coming off the boiler, and through a process, when it's exhausted, it is breathable air per EPA standards. And a traditional 1250 megawatt SCR can be over 350 square foot of duct, insulation, hours of welding, requires some scaffolding, requires crane, requires just about every discipline there is in construction to erect just one unit. And one unit can take anywhere from 6 to 8 months. So 2 units is going to take pretty much almost 2 years to erect. Okay, and so the data that I collected was the square footage, the standard man hours that it would take to do that project. The difference is what I did is I took a project and broke it in. I took that project and broke it down into 4 scenarios. The first scenario is that 100% everything was met. The labor hours that were predicted and planned was met. The materials, cost of materials was met. The square footage that was executed was met. The labor hours that were planned and estimated were met. So what established when I applied the earned value methodology is that, as the theory states for earned value methodology, it came out to be a 1.0. And as I mentioned earlier, 0.98 is what I established as my index to determine anything above 0.98 is that the project is on track and is being successful. Anything less than 0.98, the project is being affected. Okay. So as I established in the 100% was a 1.0. Now, what I did is in the second scenario, as I said, and this happens in our industry a lot, is that we went over 5% in production. Now, we met the schedule. We met the materials cost. But in production is where we were affected. Okay. And what this established based on the data results that was obtained is that even with a 5% overage in production, you still met your schedule, you still met the material costs, you still were in line with estimated completion date. It factored a 0.98. So what this tells me is that with a 0.98 and based on the research analysis, that the organization will not be affected tremendously or adversely, meaning that they may not get all their profit margin, but they still will be profitable and the project met the schedule, met the customer's intentions. The only impact was labor cost. And so this would tell an organization and the project manager that, yes, you weren't 100%, but 0.98 was an acceptable index, performance index, to determine that the project was successful. Okay. So then as we move along, I increased it by another 5%. So now what I'm saying is that in my production, my estimated production was not obtained, just like it was in the previous scenario, but we went over by 10%. Okay, and here's where it starts to outline to any organization or to any project manager that in the construction of this project, as soon as he went over 5% and was starting to lean towards 10% overage, he was severely impacted. So not only did he not obtain his profit margin, it was impacted, but his estimates on production were way off. So this caused an alarm and this, had a flag that the project manager and the estimating staff, to include the principals, needed to sit down and start discussing this project to determine whether or not where they're going to land and how much revenue that they were going to lose. And not only that, but to determine their construction processes to see what needed to be improved. Maybe it's supervision, maybe it's the foreman, maybe it's the leadman, maybe even it's the superintendent. And I would even go as far as the project manager. But if the project manager identifies this and reports this, it's going to be a slippery slope to place full blame on the project manager if he reports this in time and he's tracking it and he's evaluating this data. So if he evaluated the data as I did, this would be a severe impact, adverse impact, in which the project needs to be really looked at, a deep root analysis, because a lot of things are being affected here. So this reflected a 0.95. We're only losing a factor of 0.03 from 0.98 to 0.95, where 0.98 was acceptable, but anything less than 0.98 just proves my correlation interval that 0.98 was the index that we needed to establish. Now, as I move to the last scenario, so we increased it another 5%. So now we're at 15% over our production. So remember, we still have met the schedule. So we completed all the square footage. We've met the material cost. All the materials needed to finish this project was in line. So those are indicators that say, you know what, we're doing okay. However, when you evaluate the productivity and you evaluate the labor costs, this goes down to a 0.93, so another 0.02 hit on the performance index factor. So now, based off of the earned value methodology, I had mentioned earlier that 0.90 to 1.0, that's kind of an acceptable range per some indicators, that were produced out of Cornell University. However, as they also mentioned, that performance index is established by the project team up front. You really have to collect all your data collecting factors to determine what that correlation interval is between all those factors. Like I did for this project, I established that 0.98 was, the most that the organization can take a hit on as it relates to productivity, because it will impact the cost of the project that was initially estimated, and also impact the profit margin. My research and using the earned value methodology just fully supports that earned value methodology can be a key performance indicator and a tool for a project manager, or even the superintendent, even the executive management, to gauge the project early on to determine what is that, green light and no-go criteria. And what I mean by green light is saying that this project is going good. It's, being measured, it's being tracked, it's being managed, and it's being led in accordance with the execution plan. The no-go criteria has to be established, and with using the earned value methodology, you can set parameters by using the performance index that says, hey, we need to either take a safety stand down or a work stoppage and say, we need to improve somewhere. Well, where is that at? Well, the earned value methodology, the performance index can be established in production, in materials, in labor cost, and even in schedule. As we know in the construction industry, schedule always changes. Materials are always being added. Overages are on, materials can happen at any time. However, if you use an earned value methodology just on performance, this research proves that if you establish a realistic performance index, you can catch a bad project early on. Again, this is Brian Briggs, using earned value methodology as my research in determining acceptable productivity and measuring the progress of a project, and also determining when that project needs to be addressed by the project team. All right. Thank you.